planning get put in. There are systems in place, historic systems, but also current systems that advantage wealthier communities in terms of who has access to green space, how many trees you have. And you just need to drive around the city and you'll notice this. But there are discrepancies for sure. All right. So it's not building up equally. We have an issue. And so the city has really been trying to attack this with all of its partners. We were happy to work on the Resilient Houston Plan, the Houston Climate Action Plan. We read, the climate impact assessment was done by our chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy when she was fully at Texas Tech, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, and people are self-assembling, right? So things like this climate summit are indicative of the city and the county and our government agencies can only do so much. People also have to assemble and do what they can. So there is a lot of movement, but there's not as much on the ground action for adaptation as we'd like. All right, a couple more things, and then we're going to go into the actual interventions. So one thing about heat that is not well known is that it is connected to flooding. The hotter our communities get, the hotter the air gets, the more water it can hold. So it's not, sometimes people talk about how do we do flooding adaptation and then how do we do heat adaptation? Well, by cooling the city, using a number of strategies, we can impact how strong storms are going to be in the future. So it's not just that heat is an issue with climate change and flooding is an issue. They're actually intersected. And there's some attribution studies that came out after Hurricane Harvey that showed that between 15 and 20% more rain fell simply because of the structure of the city. So there were people likely whose homes flooded that wouldn't have flooded with all this extra heat. So that's a consideration. And that's why part of when we worked on the Children's Outdoor Bill of Rights, and this was just released on Earth Day, several of these things, these points, talked about climate change. So the second one, adequate shade in the outdoors, the ability to see wildlife, clean air, and they're all connected. And like I said earlier, we have one of the most biologically rich areas in the world. I have the pleasure of leading our City Nature Challenge team, where we go up against 400 cities across the world. And we came in first place in the US for number of species, number 5 globally. And the reason I'm getting here for this is, although this is a public health forum, I've talked about this before, I work in a One Health frame, which recognizes that all of these things are connected. The quality of our environment, the quality of the biodiversity and animals that live in and around us, including our pets, but also wild species, and our mental and physical, spiritual, and cultural well-being. These are all intersected, but we oftentimes work in silos, right? And so even though many of you, I'm going to assume that at least one person doesn't like insects on this call, because I run into people all the time. It's those little creatures that help to manage the urban forests, the wetlands, the prairies, that can actually keep us safe and healthy. So if we don't have any of those animals, our ecosystems degrade. If our ecosystems degrade, we get impacted. But we also need to see nature to stay healthy. So all the work that I do is very different than when I started off as a naturalist. It is all intersected. All right, let's get to what we can do. So the first thing I'll show you is this. Houston has a lot of this talk is really how do we reuse or design better landscapes? Houston has had a lot of landscape uses. There have been indigenous people here for 13,000 years. They managed the land through fire, hunting, and other activities. When the pioneers and colonists got here, this was a massive agricultural area, right? It's not for nothing that we have the Rice Harvest Festival, we have the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo and things. But today, if you look at the landscapes that we have in Houston, many of them are not only not healthy, but they're climate damaging. When we have this much unnecessary lawn, and I'm not talking about your front yard, although you can make it more climate friendly, these need to be mowed a lot, anywhere between 20 and 40 times a year. Every time we mow these landscapes, the city becomes hotter. We don't absorb as much water. The biodiversity habitat goes way, way down. And we're releasing massive amounts of air pollution and climate warming gases. So we have chosen this pathway for understandable reasons. We've been inculcated into the English law kind of construct. But are these landscapes indicative of the type of city we need now during climate change, flooding, heat, and public health? They're not. So how do we change this paradigm? And sometimes people are like, well, I don't want to see tall grass. And what I tell them is like, the city is literally not going to respond to heat waves, flooding, and other things differently if it doesn't physically look different. It has to physically look different because we have to manage differently. But here's an issue. So what we have is we have all of these spots. This is a thermal camera I use on my cell phone. We have all of these spots within communities that could be reinvented. So these are two stops, one up in Aldie, my home neighborhood, and one in Gulfton, a neighborhood I'm working in. And you can see that wherever the nature is present, even green lawns, which are not the most cooling, but certainly more cooling, we have these massive fluxes of heat, sometimes 40 degrees between treed areas or areas with prairies and roads or buildings. So we're talking about like 40 to 50 degree temperature difference sometimes. So how do we cool off this stuff? Well, one thing is we're going to have to do things differently. If you take a look at this research from Rice University, and you look at between 1997 and 27, what we did to add impervious hot surfaces to this region, it is kind of crazy. If you look at those numbers, the amount of concrete impervious surfaces we put down is 1.25 times bigger than the city of New York, or it's like covering 71% of Galveston Bay. And every time we do that, we make a hotter city, right? So it's not just decreasing the amount of concrete we put all over the place. And why we can still do black asphalt parking lots, I have no idea. Those are definitely the hottest surface in the city. We're going to have to rethink, what is it about this city that we did wrong in the first place? And one of the things is that we didn't really build it for human beings. We actually didn't build human habitat in many ways. We built car habitat. And when you build car habitat, it's intensive on asphalt. So how can we make more human-sized spaces, more verdant spaces, more cool spaces, more spongy spaces? Well, let me just show you a couple of things we're working on. So one of the places we're working on is Gulfton. Gulfton is an incredibly beautiful, like from the community aspect, the people there. It's a refugee neighborhood. It's an immigrant neighborhood. There are over 80 languages spoken here. This is the most diverse neighborhood in Houston. And the people I have always encountered to be extremely generous and welcoming, and also they have a great desire for what's best for their kids like anybody else. And one of the things they want is more nature. So we entered into an 11-month process to complete a basically nature plan for the neighborhood with the neighborhood called Greener Gulfton. And this plan is really based on human health and well-being, climate resilience, and biodiversity. Why climate resilience? This was the hottest neighborhood that we measured, a full 17 degrees hotter than the coolest neighborhood that we measured in the county when we did the heat mapping. That's not uncomfortable, that's dangerous. And there are places throughout the neighborhood that could be greatly helped with nature, not just for the whole neighborhood, but in terms of people's daily lived experience. All right, so let me just show you a couple of things we're working on, and then we'll show you one more model and then get to questions. So one of the things we needed to know was this. Gulfton has a nature score of 27.3. This scale goes up to 100, which means this is a nature-deprived neighborhood. It's not just climate vulnerable, it's lacking in basic nature that codes for human health. So we needed to pay attention to that. We also needed to pay attention to the fact that one of the reasons that is so nature-deprived is that it has one park for 60,000 people. Now, fortunately, there's action happening there. The county just passed master planning money. This is Precinct 4 under Commissioner Briones, to have a master plan and expand that park space. Huge, very important. But that's not enough. We need to get nature throughout this neighborhood because it's lacking. And because it's lacking, it is not uncommon to see very stark places like this. This is the corner of Rampart and Gulfton Street. As you can see, if your insides kind of cringed when you saw this, it's because we are designed to be biophilic, to look for nature, to look for trees, to look for flowers. And landscapes like this are non-neutral. They are damaging to mental health. In fact, in areas like this across the country, having hard structures all around you, being nature deprived, increases your chances of developing a mental health issue by 3 times. It lowers your self-worth, your feelings of self-esteem, self-efficacy. It can lower academic achievement. So before anybody does anything, if they live in a neighborhood like this, they're already impacted just by walking outside. So this is a daily harm, right? So part of the calling is to say, let's not stop plant trees. Let's go ahead and make this a more nature-rich place. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to try to impact people's daily lives. So where do they have their daily lives occur? Well, one is at bus stops. So one of the things we're working with Harris County Precinct 4 on and Metro is this notion that there are many, many bus stops that don't have any nature, and they're super, super hot, right? And they don't have a shelter. So maybe putting a shelter there is great, but maybe in a nature deprived area like this that suffers from heat and flooding and the lack of nature and what that means, maybe using the native ecologies of this neighborhood, which is coastal prairie, along with vines and other things, to beautify, but also to bring in things like bird calls that have been shown to positively impact human health, right? So green bus stops are one thing that we're looking at right now. There are places that are just too skinny for trees. And there are a lot of corridors in Houston, not just in Gulfton, but in Houston, think about downtown, other places that really are hot, where you can't plant trees. Well, the brilliant folks at Ultra Barrio worked with us and Ann Whitlock at Connect Community to visualize a modular shading system that also included pollinator-friendly vegetation. So you're not putting hard structure on hard structure, you're putting shading, cooling structures with nature embedded. So it doesn't also increase the burden of hard structures. We're also doing tree planting. And what's really exciting about this is that we just were told that our friends for Trees for Houston, which were really, really wonderful partners, just received enough money to plant the trees that we have spec'd for Gulfton. We went out earlier this year with our friends at Texas A&M Forest Service. They did an economic and health study for us on the value of trees in the neighborhood and how we could uplift that with planting more trees. And what we found was there could be 803 more trees just on public rights of way. This doesn't include schools or the park or the huge apartment complexes. So what we're doing right now is we're walking very intentionally with the county and the city and Trees for Houston and our Greener Gulfton Steering Committee and other people to really gear up for this. This is going to happen really quickly because of the funding that needs to be spent, but also because of the need. So it's going to be a series of interventions. Now, let me show you one more intervention that will impact people on their daily lives. Schools. Schools are a piece of publicly equitable parks, public space that we don't have to buy. We own the land, but oftentimes they are extremely lazy landscapes. We have to pour a lot of money into them. They don't soak up a lot of water. They're super hot. They're so boring that no kid wants to go out there. I've been working in schools for 25 years. But what if we reconceived of schools in neighborhoods? So typically when we build schools, we build a school, we scrape off all the good soil, we build a school, and then we put a giant hole to collect all the water. And so if we would have built the Jefferson Early Learning Center like this, that's exactly what we would have done. So we would have done that and we'd be done. But we said, no, this is a piece of public infrastructure. This is a park desert neighborhood in Alief, or that part of Alief. Where can we implant big nature? So the light green areas are native coastal prairies that once covered the neighborhood. The darker areas are wetlands that also were a major part of this neighborhood. And the purple dots are trees. If this were a typical campus, about 20 trees would have been planted. We're going to go over 200 trees this year. And so in effect, what this is a small national park for these preschoolers who are often living in apartment complexes. This is what we call a wildly healthy, climate-ready landscape. As you drive around today, look at landscapes. Look at areas that could be planted with trees or prairies or wetlands and contribute more to the health of the community. So if you take a look at this, this landscape now, it is absolutely thriving. And here's one of the points I want to make. When we talk about using nature for heat reduction, we always focus on trees. Trees are magnificent. I love trees. I am a prairie ecologist, but I love trees. They do so many things for us. But all of our native ecologies can do things. This is the MD Anderson Prairie in the middle of the Texas Medical Center that I helped put it in 2012 with many, many partners, including MD Anderson. And if you look at the thermal image, purple is cooler, white, yellow is hotter. So it's not just trees, it's the right ecosystem type for the right city landscape. Some places trees are great. Some places pocket prairies are great. Some places stormwater wetlands are great. And when we do this mixture of those plus riparian or river corridors, these 4 interconnected landscapes, what we do is we also build up the wildlife habitat. And that impacts human health as well. So there are many ways that we can do this smartly, mixing and matching ecosystems. Now, I will tell you that when I visit the MD Anderson Prairie, I often see health professionals sitting on the benches, just staring out into it. Because nature has the ability to repair, to reset your focus, to do stress reduction. So it's not surprising that the folks at MD Anderson and Texas Children and its surrounding things flock to this place because nature is healing. And that's why I talk about places like this, trees that we plant, wetlands. This is all a piece of public health infrastructure. These are mini clinics. Now, they're not provisioning the type of mental health provision that many of you might be interested or doing, but it is really critical infrastructure. So thinking about it beyond beautification is going to be super, super important. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop because I've been talking a lot. But just to wrap up, we have a really bad heat problem. It's intersected with many things. So instead of just planning for one action, heat, let's plan to make a place all of the things that I showed and also culturally connected. And I didn't talk about this too much, but creating senses of place and civic spaces are incredibly important, and nature can serve those purposes. All right, I'm going to stop, but this is an idea board. It's not a PowerPoint, so I can go anywhere. So I'm just going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jaime. Yeah, if anyone, Naomi said, this has been so fantastic. How can we as individuals get involved with this work?
Yeah, so really great question. There are multiple ways to get involved. One is, I don't want to sound like a showman here, but donating to groups that are working on climate justice or adapting the city, groups that are working at this intersectionality of health, environmental justice, and human health. So supporting those groups through either straight up donation or volunteerism. There are so many talents and gifts on this call. And one thing that we're trying to do, and we've been working with Heidi and Dr. John on this, is there needs to be much better coordination between the public health community, the conservation community, the environmental justice community, and yes, Indigenous leaders here. That's how we get to a scale and to a leveraging point where we can come together, not become each other, but we can learn how to work together across these sectors. So one of the things I would suggest is the conservation community has a fairly tenuous relationship with the health care sector. It's not that we don't understand each other, but we don't work together nearly enough, especially in a community like Houston. It has such an amazing and huge healthcare sector. So finding ways to work with groups that are taking more nature out into the community is going to be one of the best things you can do, because once we get that critical mass to show decision makers and funders and ourselves, like, we can work together on these issues. I think that's going to be great. And do a tree planting anytime you can later this year when it's not so hot.
Jaime, thank you. This is just so inspirational. Really appreciate you sharing the work that you're doing and the work and what you're doing for the communities. Kind of taking it further from the organizational space and building off of Paula's comment there.
Yeah.
I often think about that as I wander around my neighborhood of like, how could we do better just in our own little plots of land?
Yes.
Are there tools, resources, or that you would recommend for people who might want to think differently just about their own little space?
Absolutely, 100%. And I can share some resources after this, but what I would say is, I oftentimes am portrayed as anti-lawn. I'm not. I am truly anti-unnecessary lawn, right? We don't need giant campuses that are mowed. Go along I-10. It's just, I mean, these massive places that are mowed for no reason. So if you want to make your yard a more climate friendly, more interesting place, we'll send you resources, but there are things like the 9 Natives program. It shows you kind of these, quick plans, and it gives you suggested species. So what I would do is I would slowly start taking over areas of your yard that are not, that you don't need. So if you have a bunch of small kids and they're running all over the place, that's one thing. But if you don't, and you can eat into your yard a little bit, make it look intentional, make it look like a garden, pay attention to if you have a strong HOA, things like that. But I'm going to send you after this. I know that you share resources after. There's actually a state law that protects people who plant water-friendly plants, which is our natives, right? A lot of people don't know that, and a lot of HOAs don't know that either. So you can show them this bill to say, look, I'm conserving water. I'm doing the right thing and moving that. So I'm going to give you some good resources from the Native Plant Society and the prairie community and other people to show you what that looks like. And I'll send you a couple of photos of what I call climate-friendly yards, places where people have ooched out the lawn. They keep enough to make it look legible and intelligible. But yeah, then the mowing goes down. So if you're responsible for mowing the yard, my wife Katie and I actually build every spring. We actually have an entire prairie in our front yard. And the kids come by, and the dogs, people bring their dogs to take pictures and things. So it's more than just kind of like leaning in that way. It's also providing people with something cooler to look at your community. So it's civic space. Our front yard becomes civic space, which is really important for knowing your neighbors. So thank you for that question. I'll definitely send you resources.
Awesome, thank you.
And I didn't see the chat, but if there's any questions in there.
We had a comment from Katie who said, we need advocates for nature in all spaces, asking questions and making suggestions in places where we live and work, schools, house of worship, civic clubs, in our own yards and spaces. Yeah.
So one of the things that all of this entails, and as you know, in public health, this is a huge thing as well, is if people don't know the story, or if there's this broken story pipeline, it's very hard to get funding, political juice, and other things to take action. So a big part of my work is telling that story. Like, why does nature actually count? Why is it way beyond beautification? Why is it an essential function, a critical function for the city? So, what we're doing is we're applying for funding to create a jointly created nature and nature-based solutions campaign for Harris County. People really don't know the story of how important nature is, not just for beauty, but like to literally protect our bodies, to literally protect our health, our kids, all of that. And so, Katie's right. We have to do a better job of telling that story. The conservation community, frankly, has not done a good job of that. But part of the reason they haven't done a good job of that, in my opinion, it's been solely focused on biodiversity. It hasn't looked at that intersectionality between human health, equity, systemic racism, all of that stuff that impacts how our city and our county are put together. So what I'm hoping happens is that this multi-sectoral communications campaign can be used by different sectors to say, like, leaning into nature, creating green jobs to get that done. So attending to economic health as well. This is the way that we can go from a city that oftentimes is characterized by people who come in as a concrete jungle and not all that attractive to a garden city. And so, you know, I tell people, like, nobody's ever got on an airplane and is leaving Houston and go, man, that's a resilient city if I ever saw one. Like, nobody's ever going to say that. But if we're intelligent about how we reform the city and it looks like a garden, think about the places like Memorial Park, Bayou Greenways, all these great places that you think, and think about expanding that out into neighborhoods, into connectivity, all that. So one day somebody might get on a plane and, man, I've never seen a greener city than Houston. Now, it will be climate resilient. It will be healthier and it will be beautiful, but we have to be very intentional about how we do it to get the maximum benefit, take the benefits very deep.
I have a question about policy and voting. I know we have elections for City of Houston, and you mentioned complete communities. What is a way that we can engage or assess if people running, consider these factors or willing to keep them going?
So there's a couple, that's a great question, a couple things. So the Houston Climate Movement is about to host a candidate forum on environmental issues. So I can send that to you. It's coming up pretty soon. Another thing that's very important is park equity, as you all know. Houston ranks very low in comparison with the top 100 geographies in the US, where right now we're number 70th on what's called Park Score, who has access to nature in these public spaces and just facilities of public spaces. So fortunately, there is a process going on right now with some big philanthropies in town to bring this to light, tell the story of how we're underinvested in park space, and they are going to hold mayoral forum, at least one mayoral forum on park space equity. Because as somebody who's worked in Memorial Park, still working there, in Buffalo Bayou Park and in Herman Park, but has also worked in disinvested parks like Burnett Balin Park in Gulfton, the gap has just done this in the last 8 years. It has gotten worse and worse. So we need to address park space equity, and going to this mayoral forum, asking a lot of questions about how are we going to fund this moving forward. This is a public service. How can we adequately fund this? Is going to be really important. But also, like I said, just getting models like the one I'm showing, this is actually the Jefferson Early Learning Center, the background here. Making sure that we're working with the city and the county and other decision makers to say, like, let's just reinvent some landscapes. I know this doesn't look like a school campus you ever went to, but this is what we need now. We need this now. So I think that those two mayoral forums are going to be, and candidate forums are going to be really cool. So thank you for asking that. I'll send you some information today.
Okay, and CJ Hager asked, do you see an opportunity with the passage of last year's Inflation Reduction Act to further this work? And what are those specific opportunities?
Yeah, so great question. There are lots of people working to draw down federal funding. So for instance, the funding that is being used in Precinct 4 for tree planting, and is also going to be used in Gulfton, that came from the ARPA funding. Specifically, it came from CEPTED funding, which is crime reduction by design. And so using nature to reduce crime. There are IRA funding opportunities. One thing that came out of the IRA is community forestry for vulnerable frontline communities, right? So there was $1 billion put into this fund. The forestry agencies from the different states were able to apply for funding. So one of the cool things that's happening right now is they applied, the state of Texas got $23.6 million, not a solution to everything, but one of their main tasks is going to be to reforest school campuses up to 30% canopy cover. So we're going to be, trying to tap into that in Houston ISD and Alief ISD to create mini forests on these school campuses. Cooler for the kids, better for the wildlife, better for the climate resiliency. But also the city and the county and many partners, including TNC, went on a $50 million grant through this program, through another pot of money through the USDA, And we have an initiative that we're hoping to get funded called For Us Trees, or For Us Tree. And that would go only to communities that are worst first, right? So that money would have to be spent in places like complete communities, in unincorporated areas that are experiencing heat and disinvestment. So if we get that 50 million bucks, it changes the game for trees, and it creates new pipelines and processes and players. So yes, people are definitely trying to tap into all that money that we can. And unfortunately, we have a great case statement for bringing more trees to Houston because of our persistent horrible air quality, and trees can protect us from particulate matter and things like that, our persistent flooding, our persistent heat, and nature disinvestment, nature deprived. So we have, unfortunately, really good conditions to ask for money because of the way that we have not invested in nature in this equitably in this town. And we should know if we're going to get that funding here pretty soon with the For Us Tree. So if you see a big celebration happening, we got something.
Invite us to the celebration.
Yes, definitely.
This is really exciting on the policy end. I'm wondering, so much of the work of the members of the Health Equity Collective is really more direct health,
right,
and medical care, right? And then we've spent a lot of time looking at the social determinants of health, and this feels like we're going further upstream to the true root causes. What do you see as the opportunities, I guess, to link those conversations and bring in those working in more the healthcare and health programs into this type of work? It's more creating the environment in a way, but I'm wondering if there are any conversations where those linkages have begun to happen.
Well, so Methodist is working with Texas A&M and Texan by Nature, and some of you probably know about the Center for Health and Nature there, and they have a symposium every year. Much of that symposium, it's great. It's a great symposium. I go to it, and much of it is research-based. So there's definitely a reason to do that. What I would like to see is another session where we could get together between public health, environmental justice, conservation, and indigenous leaders to talk about what we can do now to work together, right? Because we can do a lot of research, and it's not that research isn't important, it's extremely important to our work. But the truth is we know enough right now to act. Right now, we can't wait until we have all the data points. We have enough, we have way too many data points to not act now from an ethical standpoint. So, I think one thing that I've been thinking about for 2024 is, and we might actually have a facility and funding to do this, is a one-day symposium that brings these sectors together to say, what are the upstream connections? Like I look at the social determinants of health, and I obviously they're research-based and it came from somewhere and it's great. But it kind of misses the fact that we're biological creatures and that nothing downstream of us can work well if we don't pay attention to that first. So get out of our heads a little bit about being human beings and think about us as biological creatures, because if we just don't have a healthy environment, everything becomes harder, right? So I look at this tiny slice for environment. I'm like, really, is it really that small? And so I think the answer to that is more interactions between these sectors. Learn to win together, learn to see each other's perspectives, learn to leverage each other's strengths. So we can talk offline, Heidi. I got an idea for that, where it would be a one-day symposium at a place like Rice. And I think we could make that work and just say, like, how are we leaning in together for practical applied interventions?
I love it. Yes, let's talk.
It also just comes to mind too. I know it, we see so much in research how dire things are, but what point does it become, what point does it become action and outputs that can help? And, this, like what you've said, Jaime, and presented today, just makes it clear, one thing is just more green space, which can be done,
Yes.
and there's research suggesting that it's much more effective than just, giving us green, giving us beautiful spaces. But yeah, no, it's refreshing to hear that. And what is it, I guess that big challenge of what does it look like to move out of silos, and how does that change the way organizations work and function? And, I mean, it's our work at hand, but that's a big task I just see is how do we move beyond our typical, well, let me show you this research that shows this conversation.
Right. Yeah. At the end of the day, for me, putting stuff on the ground is the whole point, And so if I'm not putting stuff on the ground, for me, it's just a missed opportunity. It's not that the other things that are the policy and research stuff, they're super, super helpful and they're part of the puzzle in communications but we need to put stuff on the ground like now, right? Communities are like, I'm done planning. I'm exhausted with the research, even the community-based research. I'm tired. We need trees. Put some trees on the ground, right? So I have to, as somebody who does a lot of work with the city and the county on planning and science, I have to remember that too. Like, we're ready to rock and roll. We are well into climate change at this point. It's not coming in the future. It's here. Harvey was determining where you were in the county between a 2,000 and 30,000 year event. We have 18 natural disasters declared disasters since 2000. We're well into the climate age here. So it's killed people, it's caused refugees. So let's work together to not be resilient, to come back to where we were. Let's make this a thriving green city. Let's go beyond just the basics. Let's get to a place that's culturally meaningful, beautiful, resilient, and alive, right? So we shouldn't just be aiming to just solve one problem. Like I said, we should be going for a lot of stuff. And I'd be happy to talk with the collective on, how we can kind of move these ideas into action.
Jaime, great talk. This is Dr. John. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So we've been in conversations before about, equitable access to green spaces and so forth. And one of the things, just to level set with folks here, I live in South Acres, and I have these frequent conversations with community residents. And one of the things that people talk about is, and I wonder how much that's reflected across other communities as well, is that yes, I want to beautify my neighborhood, or I want to beautify my immediate space with trees and whatnot, right? But then there's a cost perspective that's often, furthering those disparities, right? Because, let's be honest, buying a tree to plant costs a lot of money in some regards. So what is the city doing to help facilitate offsetting cost expenses in that regard for underserved communities?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I would say. One is, the mayor set a very ambitious goal for 10 years, like 4.6 million trees, but that needs action afterward, right? So I know that the city has a number of restoration programs that are happening along riparian corridors and in parks, on esplanades. So there are some ways to do that. The city, as you know, has a budget crunch. It's hard for them to lean in further, but they want to track the trees. So I think part of this is going to be, as they're doing in Chicago, in New York City, in other places, you're going to have a coalition, a public-private coalition around tree plantings, where we're pulling down federal dollars. We can pull in, hopefully, county dollars to help that, because you're right, like the cost of putting in a tree, watering a tree for 2 years, doing the maintenance, is a lot of burden for some people, right? So we can't just put this on the people to plant all the trees that they have a need for, right? So it is going to have to be a partnership. There are some really neat groups in A-Leaf and other places that help at the neighborhood level, but I don't think that we're all the way there in terms of a joint tree strategy that will get us all the trees that we need, particularly in neighborhoods where people can't own all the burden. There are, though, models in Chicago, like I said, and other places where they're helping with this. They're finding financing for this. So. And one other thing that I didn't mention, which is really, really important, is this. Everybody loves live oaks. Okay, I love live oaks too. Love them. We have enough live oaks. The reason I'm saying that is when we look at it just from a beautification standpoint, everybody wants to look like, Boulevard Oaks or Rice University with the string of live oaks. But if we get a disease outbreak of oaks, like oak wilt or something really bad, the city's going to be hurting. So when we plant trees, we need to figure out what is the mixture of trees that are going to be more climate resilient, more resilient to disease outbreaks, just like human beings. Like if you have too many of one thing, disease outbreaks happen. So we also need to, as we rethink landscapes, we also need to rethink what kinds of trees we put in where. They have to be diverse in order to make all of this work, more diverse than what we've had in the past.
Well, it's almost 9:30, and but I want to thank you again, Jaime, for coming and starting this conversation and all the resources you posted. We will be putting this up on Mighty Networks. And yes, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who was able to come today. And, if you haven't, be sure to join Mighty Networks to find out about other events. And yeah, hope everyone has a great Thursday.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of your time. I know you're busy, so we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.